Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. As usual, please consider subscribing. I would greatly appreciate it. And also if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, feel free to leave them down below. I do my best to get back to you guys as soon as possible. Anyways, let's get into it. So for today's video, I want to post a video response to one of the questions I received in this video right here. And it is from, I believe, Pratik. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. I apologize if I butchered your name. But essentially he's asking how to update a record using the Apex REST web service and Postman. So like I've said before, as much as I tried to give a response to what I think is an appropriate solution, but I also like to go back every now and then and make a video on the topic if I think it'll help enough people out. So let's go ahead and make a video addressing this person's question. And just because like this whole concept of Apex REST web services is kind of, it can be complex. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward thing to solve for, in my opinion, but it can, depending on the implementation, there can be a lot of nuances in it. I would suggest to look into the trailhead for Apex web services, or even at the Salesforce documentation. In my opinion, the Apex web services trailhead does a pretty decent job of going over like the basics. Like as an example, you'll see here, well, we've previously gone over the HTTP GET and then POST, and then now we're going to cover this one right here, which is the patch. But they do a pretty decent job. I mean, it doesn't cover like, you know, advanced use cases or like how to properly write code, or, you know, having try catches, things like that you probably should have in your production code. But they do provide sample code and snippets that you can kind of use to get an idea of how to solve for something. Like as an example, here is the HttpPatch, which is probably the one that you should use for updating records. And basically I'll do something similar to this right here. But yeah, I'll leave this link down in the description box below, so feel free to reference that as well if needed. But anyways, so let's jump into our Visual Studio Code and start writing some code out. In here, in my VS Code, and like I've said many times now in my previous videos, I have a whole video on how to get this set up on your local computer if you're interested in using Visual Studio Code to write, you know, Apex and Visualforce and Lightning Web Components, all that good stuff. But I've already gone ahead and set that up, and I've even pulled the appropriate classes that we've been using so far. So I guess this is a good time to point out that I guess this is kind of like a continuation of the Apex REST web service series that I kind of have going on. And I'm pretty sure I've even made a playlist for this. So that's kind of where I'm starting off. I'm starting off with the assumption that you either have a good understanding of HTTP GET and POST and web services in general, and that, you know, you might want to brush up on patch now. So that's my starting point for you guys. As you can see here is the code we've written in the past for the GET, and here's a helper method, here's the POST, and then here's a helper method for that as well. And essentially for the HTTP patch, which is what we will use to allow whether it's an external endpoint or I guess Postman in this case to do an update to one of our records, I'm pretty much going to kind of use a lot of the same code that we have for the POST. And the way I'm thinking of doing it is we're going to create an endpoint that's going to allow anybody that calls it to do either an update to one record or many records. And the main criteria is that they have to provide us a unique key or identifier rather that we can use to identify the record in our system. In this case, I think I'll probably just use the record ID since that's like the most unique thing we have in our org. So essentially, the requester or whoever calls our endpoint can send us a JSON list of supply records, in this case because we're using supplies as the thing that we're working with. So they can send us a list of JSON objects of supplies, and as long as there is a record ID for each supply that they want to update, we will accept that and we'll do the update in our system. So pretty simple. And as is typical with my code is, none of it is ever production grade code. This is just to give you guys an idea. So I'll probably do a lot of the same things I did in the previous videos, where like anywhere that it's more nuanced, I'll write like a to-do, like, oh, you could probably do this, but I'm not going to show you how to do that because it would make the video too long. Maybe it'll be a video in the future, but we'll see. So anyways, after saying all of that, let's actually get started. So what we're going to do is, like I said before, the person asked how we can go about doing an update to a record, and he wanted to more specifically know about how doing it in Postman. To do so, and this is merely convention, I don't know if Salesforce actually enforces this, but we should be using the annotation HttpPatch. That's the one that we use to indicate to the system that you're going to do some type of update. So let's go ahead and write that out. We'll say this is a patch, and the method, it doesn't really matter. We'll just call this, in this case, let me go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and kind of just copy most of the code for the post, since it's going to be pretty similar, I believe. We'll change some things as we're going. So we have the patch, and in this case, we'll call it update supplies, probably plural, since we said that we're going to allow either one or multiple at the same time. So we'll say update supplies. And a lot of the starter code is going to be the same. So we're going to have a success Boolean and a success message flag, which we can update depending on what happens in our code. And right here, this is something that I don't know if I explained in previous tutorials, but essentially, I think my reasoning for having this, which I'm pretty sure it's not needed at all, because whenever an endpoint calls this, there should always be a request in the REST context object. But I think my reasoning for this was that I like to be a lot more defensive in my coding, even if it's not necessary. I don't want to get too into it, but we'll keep this for now, just because we're kind of, I guess, paranoid or very defensive in our coding. But essentially, what we're saying is if the request that we received is not null, being it should be there, then we're going to parse out the request body, so that's fine. And right here, if the request body is not blank, that being null or empty characters, then we're going to do something. And we put a try catch, I guess just some simple error handling. Basically here, we're going to try to deserialize the payload we got back, and we're going to deserialize it into a list of our supply objects that exist in the supply JSON wrapper. So if we take a quick look at that, right here is we're basically deserializing it into this right here. So we're going to have a list of this type of object, the object being just the instantiated version of this class. So that looks good to me. I think what we should do, like I said, we need to have some unique identifier to be able to actually identify that, the record that we're being told to update is actually the one we want. And I don't think we can use the name, because that isn't really a unique thing in our org. At least I don't think it is. But even if it is, I think it would be better to use like some other thing, like an external ID typically. And I'm not speaking from like a position of like complete authority or anything, but if you're creating an integration between two systems, it's always a good idea to have some ID that is unique to both of those systems. Sometimes that's referred to like as an external ID from within Salesforce to the other system. But in this case, we'll just use the record ID. So we'll call it record ID. And essentially what we're saying is if whoever calls our patch endpoint passes us a list of supplies, and that supply object itself actually has a record ID and it's valid, that's a very important thing, meaning it exists in our Salesforce, then we'll allow them to do any updates to whatever fields we got back. So I think that hopefully that kind of makes sense. So yeah, I will do a small update to the supply class. Now it could use this. Okay, so moving on. This is going to stay the same. Basically, we're still deserializing a list of supplies. And right here is probably where things will change a little bit. Instead of creating a supply and then getting a list of those supplies out so we can insert them, let's go ahead and do a update supply records. So I don't know if the naming convention is that great for this specific thing, but just to keep things simple and to keep this video from getting too long, we're going to take the payload and we're going to throw it into this update supply records method that doesn't yet exist, but essentially it's going to return a list of supplies that we're going to do something to at the end. And the biggest difference will be, instead of inserting this list, this stuff should already exist in our org, so we will want to do an update like that. Now, there is another DML operation you can do, and that's called upsert, which in that case, it will either update the records that are in your list, or if they don't exist, it will insert them. So just something to consider as well. In this case, we want this endpoint to be strictly about updating records. So we'll keep it at that. And that might be something that you enforce kind of like at your integration level. Like you want to specify that this endpoint, that this endpoint is specifically only for inserting records, and this one's specifically only for updating records. So just something to consider. Anyhow, so without going into the nuances of this logic yet, I think we've pretty much are at a good point. Someone's going to call this endpoint. They're going to give us a list of supplies. Each supply object will have an ID that we can use to identify in our backend. And once we get that list, we check to make sure that the list is populated, and then we go ahead and update it. And everything else pretty much stays the same. And if a lot of this code doesn't make sense, feel free to go to that playlist. I'll link it down in the description box below. But yeah, feel free to go back to it. And I'm pretty sure I've explained all of this code in the past before. But essentially, yeah, if there's any errors, it'll kind of catch them in all this try and catch stuff. This was a comment that I said that it might be useful to have like some type of error log object in Salesforce. So you might want to like create a new record of that type and then save whatever error you're getting. But if there's no error and everything's good, the success boolean will be true and the message will be whatever is the message. And then we kind of just relay that back to the response that we send back to whoever requested on this endpoint. So once we have that, let's go ahead and create the actual method that will be in charge of, processing these records and making sure that only valid ones get updated. So this will be a private, since we don't really want anybody else to call it. So private static, and this is going to return a list of supplies or supply records, and we will call this gets or update rather. Update supply records. Like so. Yep. So I think that looks good. And inside right here, it's going to be pretty similar to that create supply records method. So let's kind of copy a little bit of it. So I'm going to go ahead and go in here and just copy this. Then we can close it back out. And in here, let's make sure everything's formatted properly. It's okay. So essentially, and maybe before I copy that, I should have kind of explained my thought process. So this update supply records method, it's going to contain the logic to basically, we have to go through, or rather, I made a mistake. You'll see here the update supply records, it expects to receive a list of these supplies. So let's go ahead and kind of copy this, so we can actually make sure that we have stuff to work with. So in here, whenever this gets called, we're expecting to receive a list of supply JSON wrapper.supply objects, and we just called it that. So essentially what we want to do is we want to iterate through this stuff right here. And just so to make things very clear, there's many ways of going about this, and I'm going to take the simplest route and just kind of assume that everything is kind of looking good and we're not really going to do much validation for fields, and just basically just keeping things as simple as possible, because there's a lot of ways of making this a bit more foolproof, I guess you could say. But I'll kind of go through that as we're kind of going through this. But essentially, what we want to do is we want to go basically loop through the supply payload, and we want to basically verify that each object is valid. And that kind of just being that, there is a record ID that, it's not null or it's not missing or whatever that is. So yeah, we want to do that. And essentially, if it is there, we could do a few things. We could create a new object or supply object, and then basically just pass in all that information that we got from this supply payload, and basically create a new supply record. And then once we have a list of those, we can kind of update them. Kind of similar to what we're doing right here. And in this case, this is the create supply logic. Essentially what we were doing is, and right here there isn't much criteria. All we did is we iterated through that supply payload that we got back, and then we create a new supply object record, or whatever you want to call it, and then we just kind of populated those fields manually, and then we added it to some supply list that we created up here. And that's like one way of going about it, right? Basically ensuring, and I'm pretty sure we can kind of just update this right here pretty easily. Essentially, let me get rid of this right here. And this is kind of like the simplest way of doing it. Essentially, what we would say is before we do any of that, we're going to basically make sure that we'll do a string that is not blank, like so. We'll get the supply, and then we'll get the record ID. So we're going to say as long as that's not blank, then we'll go ahead and basically do all of this other stuff. And let me go ahead and format this, and then we can kind of go through it again. So yeah, basically this is going to get called, and this contains all of the records that whoever called this endpoint wants to update those records. And basically we're just doing the most simplest type of, I guess, criteria checking. We're going to just say, okay, as long as they passed us in an object that contains the record ID, then we'll go ahead and update that. Now, this is kind of dangerous to kind of leave it as is. Like, you might want to check. All this is doing is checking to make sure that that record ID field is not blank. But who's to say that the system didn't mess up, or some bug was introduced to their side of the code where they gave us an invalid record ID that does not exist in our Salesforce. In that case, this code might not work, right? I mean, our DML operation is set to update. What's probably going to happen is you'll probably get some DML exception saying can't update a record that doesn't exist, because we received a record ID from an external endpoint that doesn't actually exist in our system. So like this code, I'll probably leave it as is, just for demonstration purposes. And I'm pretty sure this video is getting a lot longer because I'm saying a lot of stuff. But something that might be good to think about is, okay, if it made it past this check, then perhaps store that record ID like in a list or a map that you use to query into your system to make sure that record ID actually matches up to a record that exists in your system. So that might be something to do. And because I'm lazy, and this should probably be a second video, which I'll probably make in the future at some point. Basically, like add validation to record ID to ensure it matches a record in the system. And if that doesn't make sense, basically what I'm going to say is query the record or the supply record by record ID. I hope that makes sense. Essentially, this is just making sure that whatever record ID we get from the external endpoint actually does match a record in our system, and it then is safe to be able to update it. The assumption we're going to make here, just to keep this video from getting much longer than it already is we're going to assume that this record ID we got from the external endpoint actually is valid and does match a record in our system, just for simplicity's sake. Like I said, I'll make another video in the future, probably about this stuff, so we'll see. But anyways, under this assumption, we got back a record ID, and it was valid. We're establishing that. Because it's valid, now we can go ahead and create a brand new supply record right here. And like I said here, we probably should add validation for these types of fields, which we're not going to do here. And that's just to ensure that, we get back good data or not bad data. But essentially, what we want to do is, it kind of seems like we went ahead and created a brand new supply record, but that's not really the case, because what we're going to do is we're going to get our supply record, and we're going to say the ID is equal to this record ID up here. And essentially what you're doing is you created a brand new supply record object in memory. But the moment that you give it a record ID, you're basically telling the system, oh, it's going to match some record that already exists in our Salesforce org. So this won't be a brand new thing that we're introducing to the system. It's just an update. And you indicate that with the DML operation that we did above, which was the update. But essentially we passed in a valid record ID that already exists to this brand new object we created in memory. And with the help of the DML update operation, it's going to just update that record for us. So I hope that makes sense. So once we have this right here, now here's another, basically, actually, let me remove this and put it down here. And this is kind of like another thing that you guys should be aware of. Once we have associated the record ID to the one we want to update to, we're, again, kind of starting off with the assumption that these are the 4 different fields that we always want to update. Well, what about in the case that the patch endpoint is called and we get an object and they only gave us like these 2 fields, like the quantity and the name. They didn't actually give us the status and the unit cost. Like in that case, you know, what would happen here, right? If we got fields that doesn't exist, like would it set them to null? Would it set them to 0? Those are things that you would have to take care of. And basically what we're doing here is we're doing explicit updates, right? And there are ways of, instead of like, you know, calling out each field to be updated by whatever you think we would got in the payload, when it's entirely possible that the endpoint only gave us like these 2 fields to update. There are ways of getting around that. And if we jump back into the documentation real quick, as an example here, or not documentation, the trailhead. If we go back to the patch right here, this code right here, this code snippet right here, and basically just pointing your attention to these lines right here. What's happening here is the payload is being deserialized into just like a generic string with an object, and they call it parameters. And basically here, instead of explicitly saying, you know, this is the field that we should update from the payload itself, well, what they did is they basically did it dynamically, saying, okay, whatever we got from the parameters, we'll set it to be this, and we'll set it to be that. So that might be a way of getting around it. Now, I'm kind of just throwing out as many ideas as I can into this video, but if we go back here, you might notice that, well, these are the fields that we can expect to receive from the endpoint, right? Like these are the endpoint fields, and somehow we need to match them up with the fields that are ours, the API field names, right? So you might have to write some more logic to, you know, basically check that if we got these fields from the payload, well, then we need to update them. But if we didn't, then we don't need to update those. So just more ideas. Essentially, if you boil everything down to what I'm saying is, make sure there is validation for fields that you want to update, and make sure you have a lot of validation for your record IDs that you're updating, because all this stuff is very sensitive. But for the purposes of this demo, we are basically making the assumption that anything we receive is a valid record, and all the fields we receive are valid, just to make things very simple. Like I said, in the future, I will make more videos that go into much more nuance. This is just to kind of get a simple patch video out there. So with all that said, I hope that kind of makes sense. But yeah, pretty much, I'm pretty sure, unless I'm missing something, this is all we pretty much need. Our update supply records, it's going to go through the payload, make sure that the record ID exists and it's valid. We have that assumed. And if it is, then we associate that supply record to this brand new supply record we created in memory. Once that's done, we add it to the outside right here. Essentially, we're doing this because we don't want to have an update inside of a for loop, because that's very inefficient. So all we do is we process all the records, we add that to a list, and then we throw that back out to whatever method called this. So I'll go ahead and hit save on this, and we can now close this up, and we can go back to our update right here. So like I said before, we got our update supply records. They should be valid. If it's not, if we actually have some records in our supply record list, then we can go ahead and do the update itself. So if a lot of this or some of this or none of this made sense, feel free to leave down comments in the comment section down below, and I will do my best to get back to you guys. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and actually get this into our org. What I'm going to go ahead and do is I will go ahead and deploy the JSON wrapper first to our org. This one, if you recall, had a very small update to the supply class, where we now are also allowing the endpoint to send us a record ID. And the main class itself now has support for patch. So let's go ahead and also deploy this out. And that looks like it ran successfully. So let's go ahead and go into our org very quickly, and we'll go here, and I will click on this supply name with a name of 1. For some reason, we have that. And basically, we want to get the record ID, so it's right here in the URL. And let's go ahead and update the name one. We'll do some updates actually to this record, and we'll see if it actually worked. So I'll grab this here, and actually let's jump into our Postman very quickly. And first I have to make a connection. So I already have all these endpoints set up, and I'm pretty sure I've made a video in the past about how to use Postman and how to set up the endpoints and all that good stuff. So again, starting with the assumption that you guys already know how to do this. If you don't, please watch those videos, which I will link down in the description box below. But anyways, so first things first, we need to authenticate ourselves, and that leads us to getting an access token. So I will go ahead and grab that. Then next we can do a supply request, and you'll notice here, this is a post, and we actually wanted to do a patch. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this one, and we'll change this to patch right here. And we still have this data that we were using beforehand, which is fine. But let's go ahead and go into the headers and give it our brand new access token. So we change that to the new one, I believe. Yep. Okay. So that looks good. And in our body, I'll go ahead and just for now, we will just do one update to one Salesforce supply record. We want to change the name from name one to, we'll change it to like new awesome supply or something, just something completely random that would not exist in our org, so we can know that we actually are updating it. And we want to give it now also another key value attribute. This will be a record ID, and the ID will be our record ID. So let's go ahead and grab that one more time right here, copy and paste into here. And for the quantity, let's make this a quantity of like 22, and the unit cost will be like 3, just so we know that they're completely different. And let's go ahead and verify that the quantity and unit cost are actually different. So we see here the quantity is 1 and the unit cost is $1 US. So that should change if we didn't make any mistakes at all. So let's go ahead and go into our patch, and let's go ahead and fire this off. So we'll do a send right here. And it looks like we're getting back a response with the success of true and message of supply request processed successfully. So let's go ahead and refresh our page right here. And we see now that the supply name is new awesome supply with a quantity of 22 and unit cost of $3. So that kind of covers the, one update at a time. But because this code that we built is somewhat modular, or at least not that badly written, we should be able to do, multiple updates at a time. So let's go ahead and do add another object right here. And for the first one, we'll leave that the same, but instead we'll call this old awesome supply. So a little bit of change, and we'll set the quantity to 2, but the unit cost to 10. And for the second one, we will do old, we'll just call this old, new supply. And the quantity will be 220, and the unit cost will be 30. But let's go ahead and grab a record ID of a brand new record in our org. So let me just go back to the recently viewed, and we will do, actually, let me refresh this. Let's go ahead and grab the name to record. I will get the record ID right here, and let's make a note of the quantity, 2, and the unit cost being $2 US. So we'll go back in here. And essentially what we're saying is we want to update this record. We're going to change the name from name 2 to new supply, and the quantity to, and the unit cost to these different values right here. So let's go ahead and hit send one more time. And we looks like we got success, true, message, supply request processed successfully. Okay, so let's go ahead and verify that that happened. I'm going to go back to this record, the first one, and it looks like it is now old awesome supply with quantity of 2, unit cost of 10. Which is what we had right here. And for the other record, let's go ahead and refresh it. And it should have changed, yep, to new supply, quantity of 220, and unit cost of $30, which is basically what we had here. So yeah, I hope this has been somewhat helpful to you guys, and hopefully my ramblings kind of made sense. But one more time, just to kind of really drive this home, as it stands now, this code does not have support for an invalid record ID. And even if it did have support for that, you'll see here that this message can't really handle that. And it can't really tell you like that this one failed or that this one processed successfully, right? Like we haven't added logic to kind of handle that. And the way you would do that is we would go back up to our patch, which is right here. And basically we would need to add a lot more code and logic to tell the user or whoever called the endpoint that, you know, this record processed successfully or this one did not process successfully. Or if you have a completely different requirement, which is like it's an all or nothing approach, then you could do that as well. But I hope that you guys kind of get the gist of it with this simple demo. And yeah, we'll go ahead and start making more complicated demos in the future that go into a lot more nuance and, you know, more of the good stuff. But yeah, I hope you guys have found this useful. Don't forget to subscribe if you aren't already, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.